bring us up to speed, if you would, about the latest, what's happened overnight and how significant an escalation it amounts to. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Well, this was an escalation on quite a large scale. It was probably the most intense phase in this conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, probably since 2006, the war in 2006, with possibly hundreds of rockets and drones being launched towards Israel, and Israel preempting by an airstrike very early in the morning, when they probably got accurate intelligence that Hezbollah was about to attack with thousands of these missiles and drones. But we still need to see whether the good news, Hezbollah says that for today this is the end of this phase, and both sides will assess the next steps.
And Professor, Hezbollah warning that this is phase one of an attack on Israel. What might phase 2, 3 or 4 look like?
That's exactly the question. Israel, the assessment in Israel that it was Tel Aviv and the head of the headquarters of the military intelligence and Mossad were targeted. You can just imagine what would have happened had they managed to hit such targets at the heart of Israel. What would have been the response by Israel? So we are in the cusp of potentially a full-blown war. Both sides, they said they are not interested in that, but they're acting in a way that might lead to it. While we also know that this came as a retaliation of the Israel assassination of the chief of staff of Hezbollah, Fouad Shukur, and then Iran also promised to retaliate the killing of the head of Hamas, the political head of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, for his assassination in Tehran. While there is a Israeli delegation that left for Cairo to negotiate a ceasefire. So it all happens, it's all connected at the same time, while it might improve if there is a deal over ceasefire. It might get also much worse.
And when you say, we're on the cusp of all-out war, just how close are we to that prospect?
Well, we are in the midst of something very serious that can deteriorate quickly. You can just imagine, because such operation can have their own dynamic, their own momentum. They create a momentum which is a negative one. If it hits more civilians, that force the other side to retaliate. It's the level of the damage, it's the intensity of that, the quality of the assets hit. And it can always, this tit for tat will lead to a much worse war. And with it also the rhetoric that you hear from both sides, and how other actors, for instance, Iran or the Houthis in Yemen, are they going to join in? All of this is going to decide probably with the next few days the magnitude of this phase in the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah.
Let me ask you about that, if I could, because as you say, we have been waiting for some weeks now to see what Iran's response would be to those assassinations. Is the airstrikes that have been launched overnight by Hezbollah, which are, of course, basically an Iranian proxy group, are they part of that response, Yossi? Or do you think the actual retaliation from Iran is separate and still to come?
Yeah, I think we need to understand while Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran, it also works independently and takes a decision independently. Whether this is coordinating with Iran and part of the overall reaction or not, time will tell. There are pressures on Tehran not to retaliate against Israel, at least not on again of magnitude of what we saw back in April of sending hundreds and hundreds of missiles and drones. The United States already sent an air care group closer to the region, but the retaliation probably will come. The question whether it will be more limited in terms, for instance, an assassination somewhere else, or joining in what Hezbollah tried to do this morning.
Understood. And just lastly, all of this escalation, this latest outbreak of violence, it comes, of course, after weeks of intense diplomatic efforts by the UK, the US, France and others to avoid this sort of escalation. Is this a sign that those attempts have failed and that actually the clout that all of those nations have with Tehran and with the Israeli government too are perhaps not enough?
I think they succeeded partially, but not entirely, and a lot of it to do actually with the failure to end the war in Gaza and having a ceasefire there and return the hostages. I think this can start and create a momentum of also discussing how to de-escalate relations with Hezbollah and Iran. But the first step has to be a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas.
Thank you for coming on. Professor Yossi Mekelberg, Associate Fellow of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House.